So she said, I will give you a reference to do business studies, but you're not going to university. That's not for the likes of you. And I was so upset. And I remember thinking when she said, um, that I wasn't going to pass my English A level anyway, and I thought, well, I'll show you, you old cow. Excuse my French. And I thought, and if anything, it actually made me work harder because I thought I am not failing this exam. When people kind of annoy me or choose me off or whatever, I think you're going in a book.
You're going in a book. I'm writing you down. I'm writing you down for filth.
Yeah, exactly. But I find it fascinating that people call it dystopian because I must admit, when I was writing it, I never viewed it as such. And for me, it was a kind of playing around with the mirror image of kind of our world and what it's like to kind of just have people make assumptions about you and assume things about you and feel they know you without having exchanged a word because of how you look.
Malorie, I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be talking to you. I feel like my younger self is literally crying right now.
Oh, don't cry.
You've been such an inspiration to so many, and I just want to start by really thanking you so much for your service to young readers. Am I right that you've now published 70 books for young people?
Yes, I have. My autobiography, Just Saying, was the 70th. So I think it actually was the 71st, but who's counting? But they're not all novels, I hasten to add. Some are picture books and early readers and so on. But yeah.
It's incredible. I mean, we're going to talk about Noughts Crosses today, which is one of my favorite books of all time. It's the first in the series of 6 books published over 20 years, which actually brings us right up to date with Brexit and Donald Trump. I found Noughts Crosses in my school library when I was 11 years old, and it has everything: forbidden love, coming of age, dysfunctional families, and the books were still kind of coming out as I was reading them, and that sense of anticipation was really something that was very exciting for me. I feel like I was growing up with the books, and it was also when I actually started recommending books to people. That was the first one where I was like, you have to read this book. And I wanted all my friends to read it with me. So I think eventually, Noughts Crosses is the book that led me here. So I feel very lucky to be talking to you today.
When the book came out, it was a very slow burn. And I think a lot of its momentum happened via word of mouth. And people saying to their friends, yes, and saying, oh, read this book. And what I've had when I've been doing book signings and things is I've had parents tell me that their children insisted that they read it. And because the first one came out so long ago, I've had parents saying to me, I read this as a teen, so I've given it to my teen to read. And I think, wow, that's amazing. Makes me feel really old, but that's amazing.
No, but I remember when I was reading it, I was telling my parents to read it as well. So we have all the books at home, and it's just something that we've all shared with each other. And I think also just what sets it apart from other young adult fiction at the time is that you address racism and classism in British society so head on, by flipping reality that is the Black population that has all the power, and you create this brilliant premise to really explain racism to children. And I thought maybe we start. Well, I wanted to start by asking you, can you give the listeners a quick summary of what the book is about? I've heard you say that Noughts Crosses wasn't so much a book I wanted to write, but a book I needed to write. Can you expand on this?
Well, basically, Noughts Crosses is about the friendship and eventual star-crossed love between Callum, who's a nought, and Sephy, who's a cross, in a world where they're told that noughts and crosses shouldn't really mix. And the story takes place throughout their teenage years. And, it's sort of like my homage to Romeo and Juliet. It's sort of like it was inspired by that. And I kind of felt like I'd written 49 books, and I was still being criticised in some quarters for not writing overtly about racism. And it was sort of, Malorie, why aren't you writing about racism? Which really used to work my nerves because I thought, is that what you think I'm only qualified to write about as a black writer? I've got to write about racism.
Mm.
And I have always, always kicked against people sticking labels on me or trying to put me in a box and say, that's your lane and you can't move out of it. And so I kind of felt, okay, I have 49 books under my belt. Not all of them are in print, I hasten to add, but I had 49 books, published books under my belt. And I thought, okay, for my 50th one, now I'm ready to write about racism. And it was around the time of the Stephen Lawrence case. And I remember seeing the docudrama about how the Lawrence family had been treated. And I was so angry. God, it made me so angry. And and I thought, I need to write about racism. I need to do something. I want to do something to kind of address what it's like to be considered a second class citizen and treated like that. And then I had and then I kind of thought, should I write a story about slavery and the legacy of slavery? And all my friends, black, white, Asian, whatever. It was when I said I was thinking of writing a story about slavery. What do you reckon of racism? And it was like, and for my friends of color, it was kind of, oh God, that's so painful. Why do you want to go there? And
Mm.
for my sort of white friends, it was, well, that was so long ago. Why do you want to go there? And what was fascinating to me was it's like everyone knew what was going to be in the book, and I hadn't written a word. And so I thought, oh, well, now how can I do this to play with people's assumptions and about what the book is going to be about? And the thing about in Noughts and Crosses, I only mention colour once. They're always noughts and crosses, or the derogatory names for them are blankers and daggers. And so I only mention colour once throughout the whole book. And I remember when I sent my mum a proof, and she said she was reading it because I wanted to play with people's preconceptions about who Callum and Sephy were as people. And I remember I sent my mum a proof, and she phoned me up, and she was irate, and she said, Callum's a naught, right? I said, that's right. She said, is he white or black? I said, he's white, mum. So she said, so Sephy's black, the rich girl's black. I said, yes, that's right, mum. She said, now I'm going to have to start the whole book again. And she was so vexed. And then she was sort of like, and then it was, I thought, yeah, that's working. That's working. That's exactly what I wanted. I wanted
Exactly,
people to
that's the
see.
reaction you want.
Exactly.
I found it interesting that you mentioned Stephen Lawrence, and I thought maybe just for our international readers a bit, if you could just tell us a bit about that case and what happened.
Well, Stephen Lawrence was a teenager who was walking home with his friend in Eltham part of London, and they were jumped by five white guys. And Stephen Lawrence was beaten to death, and then the Lawrence family were anonymously told who might be responsible, and they went to the police, and the police treated it like, the friend was a suspect first of all, and then the family were dismissed, and the whole thing was just, it was just a complete miscarriage of justice to begin with. And in fact, only two of the five who allegedly committed the crime have been brought to justice. But the whole thing was just reading it in the news as it was happening, and then watching the docudrama just really drove it home as the contemptible way that the Lawrence family had been treated. And it was one of those things where, a boy had lost his life, and the way they were treated, the family were treated as if they weren't human. It was terrible. And so I just really, really wanted to address what that is like when you're kind of, things like when I go into a department store and being followed around by security guards or staff because they
Yeah.
think I'm going to steal something, or if you go into spaces and people are giving you a second and a third and a fourth look, kind of like, well, why are you here? And and
Mm.
it's things like at school when I said to my careers teacher, she said, what do you want to do, Malorie? And I said, I knew what I wanted to do from the time I was 8. And I said, I want to be an English teacher. I want to go to university and do an English and drama degree, and I want to be an English teacher. And she looked at me and said, well, black people don't become teachers. She said, why don't you be a
Oh
secretary
wow.
instead? And I looked at it and I thought, I don't want to be a secretary. I mean, no offense to secretaries, but that's not what I wanted to do. But her thing was, well, black people don't become teachers. Why don't you be a secretary? And then she said, well, I'm not going to give you a reference to go to university. And then she, in the end, she said, well, why don't you do business studies? Because when I remember when she said that, I was so upset, and she could see my
Yeah,
face.
of
And then she said, and
course.
I don't think you're going to get your English A level anyway. And I've never failed an English exam in my life. Thank you very much. And then so she said, I will give you a reference to do business studies, but you're not going to university. That's not for the likes of you. And I was so upset. And I remember thinking when she said, um, that I wasn't going to pass my English A level anyway, and I thought, well, I'll show you, you old cow. Excuse my French. And I thought, and if anything, it actually made me work harder because I thought I am not
Yeah,
failing this exam.
yeah, it's unbelievable. And you think, that we've progressed in some way, but this book was published over 20 years ago. I
Mm.
mean, I wonder how the book would be different if you were writing it today, or I guess to put it in another way, in what ways better or worse? Has the world changed since you wrote Noughts and
Well,
Crosses?
that's an interesting question. I think people have become. I hate to use this word, but I think people have become less tolerant. But I always thought I feel I deserve to be more than tolerated. And so I do feel there's been the people like Trump and so on, that I think they have actively used people's fear as a way to divide people. And it just seems that, then we had Brexit and so forth, and then the whole um all the talk about somehow immigrants are our enemies, and people fleeing from persecution and um, conflicts around the world are somehow our enemy, and that's how we should view them. And I just find it so sad that that's where we are, and I kind of feel um, and so I think, and sadly, I mean, I must admit, I wrote it, and then first of all, it was, well, is this going to get published, and then is anyone going to read this? And I thought I'm going to get a right kicking for addressing the subject in the first place, and then I thought, and my dearest wish is actually people read this and think, oh yeah, but this is a historical tract. I mean, this couldn't happen now, but unfortunately, it's still relevant, and
One
I mean,
thousand
fortunately
percent.
and unfortunately and fortunately for me, but it's still relevant because these things are still happening, and there's still this thing of judging people based on their background or their religion or whatever. And I just makes me despair, because I grew up with Star Trek. I'm a Trekker. I admit it freely. I'm a nerd and a geek and all of those. I love it, and I just think that I really buy into this thing of, we get past our issues on this planet and then we can go and visit the stars. But all of this nonsense about religion or color or whatever is over and done with. So I thought, when I was growing up, I thought, yeah, when we hit the 21st century, it's going to be so
It's
brilliant, and
gonna
we're going to be,
change. Yeah.
exactly, it will change. And here we are in the 21st century, and we seem to be going backwards, not forwards. But I think the overall momentum is forward, and I have to keep believing that. So and I think we will get there. It's just, unfortunately, sometimes for every 2 or 3 steps forward we take a couple of steps back, and I think
Yeah.
maybe we're at the end of that and we can start moving forward again. Let's hope so.
I hope so. I hope so. Sometimes I just tell myself, sometimes it has to get really bad before it gets good.
Mm.
But then I'm also, there's so much back and forth on that, because when I'm surrounded by my friends, I'm like, oh, I'm talking to people who are like-minded and they feel the same way as me, and then I forget about the world and how big it is. And then that's the people that you have to reach, and the people who you have to really start the conversation with, because those are the people who really surprise you. There's no point in shouting at, yelling at people who are thinking exactly the same as you. That's where the problem lies, I guess.
I think so. I think it's very easy to think that your sort of cohort of friends represents the world, and it actively took me a while to kind of wrap my head around the fact that there are so many opposing views. I mean, when I was in my teenage years, I thought, I really thought all I needed to do is sit down and converse with people, and I could change their minds about
Yeah.
me. It took a long time to realize that there are some people whose views are never going to change, but that's not on me. Which is part of the reason I started writing for children and young adults in the first place, is because you hope to get to people who are still making up their minds. And it's not like I'm presenting answers in any of my books. What I hope I'm doing is is I'm asking questions, and I'm also setting up something for debate, for conversation. Let's talk about it. It's like, one of my favorite songs is Marvin Gaye's What's Going On. And the whole thing of, talk to me so you can see what's going on. Let's have a conversation.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And let's have some nuance in the discussion. It's not everything is binary. It doesn't have to be black or white. You're either for me or you're against me. But that seems to
Yeah,
be
yeah,
the way
yeah.
the discourse is going at the moment.
Yeah, everything's very polarized.
Yes, indeed.
The novel is often described as dystopian, which I find interesting, and I imagine you have something to say about that.
Well, dystopia makes it sound like it could never happen, and it's and it's funny because I never thought of it as a dystopian novel. I thought of it as speculative fiction because it's flipping the world, or flipping the
Yeah.
Western world. But I find it fascinating that people call it dystopian, because I must admit, when I was writing it, I never viewed it as such. And for me, it was a kind of playing around with the mirror image of kind of our world, and what it's like to kind of just have people make assumptions about you and assume things about you, and and feel they know you without having exchanged a word, because of how you look, or
Yeah, yeah,
the
yeah.
the deity you believe in, or which gender you claim, or whatever. I find that really interesting, that there's so much prejudging going on. And I kind of wanted to address that in my books.
Yeah, I guess it goes back to the age-old saying of never judge a book by its cover,
Indeed. Indeed.
There are some scenes in the novel which are not the most dramatic, but more quietly expose the insidious nature of racism. And I'm thinking specifically about the scene when Callum is challenged for being in the first class carriage of a train.
Mm,
And it's
mhm.
annoying for Sephy, but it's absolutely devastating for Callum. And there's also the scene where Callum asks, his history teacher about the omissions of Noughts' achievements in history books. Am I right in saying that these are both based on your own experiences?
They are, and it was the first time I'd ever put my real experiences uh, that so overtly into one of my stories. And the train incident was the first time I traveled first class, and I saved up, and I thought, well, I'm going to treat myself, travel first class. And then the ticket inspector accused me of stealing the ticket, and he said, well, where'd you get this ticket from, and blah blah. And it was humiliating, because of course everyone in the train carriage was looking at me, and I thought I bought this ticket, but he kind of refused to believe me. So the whole thing was mortifying. And that was my late teens, early 20s, and so that sort of stuck with me. And the history teacher is, again, a conversation I had with my history teacher at school, when I said to her, why do you never talk about black scientists and achievers and inventors? And she said, because there aren't any, Laurie. And she said it with such a smug grin on her face, and I thought, and I had no comeback, because I'd never been taught about any. And it was only when I reached my 20s, and I could learn for myself. And I found a bookshop, a black bookshop in Islington in London. And that's where, apart from my mortgage, that's where my money went, and buying books. And it was sort of like buying all the books in this bookshop, and it's sort of fiction and non-fiction, and just devouring them and learning about black scientists and pioneers. And I thought, there are so many, but of course she hadn't been taught any, so she thought there weren't any.
Mm,
And then and that's this sort of myth that she was perpetuating as she taught. And again, it was kind of like, because there aren't any, Laurie, and it was sort of, again, it was so humiliating. And I thought there must be
yeah, of
some,
course.
but I didn't learn about them till I was in my 20s. So again, that's something I put in my book. So I kind of think writing is it's so cathartic for that, because when people kind of annoy me or choose me off or whatever, I think you're going in a book.
You're
So,
going in a book. I'm writing.
so,
I'm writing you down. I'm writing you down for filth.
yeah, exactly. Because I remember I was taking my daughter to we were going to a supermarket to buy whatever, and I was coming out the supermarket holding my daughter's hand, and these two black guys were walking towards me, and they looked at me and they looked at my daughter, because my daughter's dual heritage, and they looked at me and they looked at her and they looked at me and they said, "You slag." And they carried on walking, and I was so angry. But I had my daughter and she's just chatting away, because she didn't even hear them and it didn't register. But I turned around and I really wanted to scream at them, but I thought, I can't, my daughter's here, just don't do it, just walk away. And but they found themselves in checkmate, so, which is the third in the Noughts and Crosses series.
Yeah.
But it
No, I
was,
know. I've
yeah.
read everything up until Double Cross. I think
Okay.
2008. That was
Yeah.
like I've read all of those. Do you think we've made any progress with like the school curriculum now?
I think, well, it depends which curriculum you're talking about, because I think some of the curriculums, the curricula rather, are trying to kind of be more inclusive, are trying to have more contemporary authors on them. One of my books, Boys Don't Cry, I think, is on one of the school curricula, English curricula, and I think they're making progress, but it's slow progress.
Another thing that I think the book does really, really well is show how language can be used as a weapon. And whether that's you taking characters from everyday life and writing them into your book, or how when Callum says in the book, noughts, even the word was negative, nothing, nil, zero.
Mm-hmm.
And I also noticed that you capitalized the name Crosses and not the name Noughts, which is very ahead of your time. And when Sephy uses the racist slur blankers to describe Noughts, that's basically, it's almost like the end of her relationship with Callum. You very cleverly signpost to young readers how words themselves are part of the way racism distorts, corrupts, and destroys people. I found that so brilliant in the way that you did that.
Thank you. I mean, it's this thing where, unless you're at the receiving end, it's very hard to kind of realize just how devastating, how powerful those words can be. And it was this thing, sort of like, of apart from with money, black tends to have negative connotations. So if you're in the black, then you've got money, and if you're in the red, you haven't. But it's sort of things like blackmail and black, and I'm in a black mood and whatever, and it's kind of like it's that kind of connotation, which is kind of it's very insidious. And so but I fully claim, and someone asked me to describe myself, I'm a woman, and then I'm a black woman with a capital B, and so I kind of, it's about reclaiming that, I think. And I think that's why I wanted Callum to say that, and say, the whole thing about naught sounds like zero, sounds like nils, or a nil or nothing, and it's in the very name, in what they're called, has that negative connotation. And I thought that was very, and with Crosses, it's that kind of thing of, I wanted that feeling of feeling they were closer to God in every way, kind of thing, thinking, and that sort of that kind of vibe. So they're and I kind of wanted that to be underplaying what's going on in the story, but first and foremost, it had to be about Callum and Sephy and their friendship, and you had to believe in them and care about them as characters, and everything else is kind of the backdrop, and obviously it affects their lives. But for me, most important were the characters, and hoping that the people reading the book would really invest in them and care about them, and kind of really grow to feel like they were real people and friends, and that they cared about.
Well, I guess sticking with Sephy and Callum for a moment, whose love story is the beating heart of the book, and their friendship is the beating heart of the book. Theirs is this ultimate forbidden love, and I remember rooting for them so hard while I was reading it. And you mentioned earlier that their story is partly inspired by Romeo and Juliet, and I noticed this is one of the books on your recommended reading list that you've given us, which elements of Romeo and Juliet did you particularly draw on?
I think I think it was I think it was like the third Shakespeare play that we did at school, and I was blown away by the fact that they were teenagers. I mean, it is a bit Solomon Grundy, and it all happened so quickly. I think within the space of a week, they kind of meet and marry and then die, kind of. So it's really quickly, it's kind of condensed. But I just, it was the fact that there were misunderstandings, and then they were trying to they just wanted to be with each other, and the families were saying no, and then it was like people working against them and some people working for them, but it was not to be, and then and then the two of them just dying, and that's what it took for the families to finally say no more. Okay,
Yeah.
and put their conflicts aside. And I thought, and I remember we went to see it as a play. It was one of the first Shakespeare plays I went to see at the theatre, and oh, I fell in love with it. I just thought it was amazing, and again, it kind of it instilled in me a lifelong love of Shakespeare. I after I saw Romeo and Juliet, I sat down and read through all the other tragedies off my own bat because I thought they were amazing. Still do.
Well, now I think we need to talk about that ending, Malorie.
Okay.
You broke me. I mean, I read somewhere that you were in tears when you wrote the ending of this book. I mean, was this really the only way for this story to end?
Well, you know what it was, because and there was a brief moment when I was writing it and I was in tears and I thought, oh, you numpty, for goodness sake, you're the one writing it. And then I thought, well, should I change the ending? And then I thought, no, you can't. This has got to be the ending. But there was that brief split second where I thought, oh, should I change it? But then I thought I can't, because the whole point is to show that racism maims and it kills. And I thought I can't shy away from that. That's the point of writing it in the first place. And as I said, it was my homage to Romeo and Juliet and, West Side Story and so on. And so I kind of thought I have to keep this ending. But I must admit, writing it, I was in tears, and I'm not going to lie. I mean, but it was the only ending for the book. I mean, do you agree?
I mean, I remember it being so shocking and heartbreaking, and this was really the first book that really emotionally rocked me. And I'm sure that this was the moment that I got the bug that all my books that I read should make me feel something. Like, people always comment that all my book recommendations are quite emotional and intense, and I think that all stems from reading Noughts and Crosses at 11 years old.
But I like books that hit me in the feels, as it were.
Me
I
too.
think,
Me
I really want to feel with the characters. And when they laugh, I want to laugh. And when they cry, I want to cry. And I kind of feel that's why when I work, I tend to get the sort of overall plot arc first and my plots first. But what I spend my time on is creating the characters and really getting to know them. And I do mini biographies for all my major characters, and so that they become real people to me before I even start writing. Because if they're not real to me, they'll never be real to anyone reading the story. So I invest an awful lot of time in making sure that they feel like three-dimensional real characters to me. So so
Yeah.
when you say that it broke you, I'm sorry, but I'm really glad. Sorry, not
Yeah.
sorry. So
Well, I was about to say, I was like, you do a very good job at creating three-dimensional
oh, thank
characters, because I felt so much for both Sephy and Callum while I was reading it. It was just beautifully written and poignant and heartfelt and
you. Oh, thank
emotional
you.
and heartbreaking. It was all those things, and I still it's at the top of my recommendations. So I'm
Thank
just
you.
again so happy to be having this conversation with you.
But you know what? I think for me as well, because when I was growing up, I think practically every book I read had a happy ever after ending, and that they all lived happily ever after. And and then when I was a teen and very jaded teen, I kind of thought that this is not true life. That every book
Totally.
has a happy ever after ending. For some people, they don't get a happy ever after. I wanted it to be a hopefully ever after ending, because the hope lies with their child. who's kind of just born at the end of the story. And so, and I think for a number of people, maybe they, especially if you're from an immigrant background where you put up with an awful lot of crap, but you hope that your children will have it easier and their children will have it easier still. And it's about investing in your children and your children's children. And I wanted that kind of feel. I wanted it to be a hopefully ever after, in that their child had been born. Callie Rose was born. And so the hopes for the future lay with their daughter.
Yeah, of course. Before we wrap up, I can't let you go without asking you what you're working on next and when we can expect to see it.
Well, I am I'm working on a book at the moment, which is about a teenage girl who has cancer, and her brother is how her brother's trying to cope with the fact that they're going to lose their sister. He's going to lose his sister. But that said, it's kind of wrapped up in a kind of adventure story. And so I'm kind of world building on that, because they actually go to somewhere that's completely different to this world. So I'm really enjoying that. And I'm also working on my first adult novel. I've written short stories for adults, but it's my first adult novel, which is a crime novel. And a part of that is based on a real incident that happened to me. So I'm I'm going to incorporate that into my crime novel.
Wow.
So I'm doing my crime novel, and I've got this sort of other story for younger readers where I'm world building. So I've just got both of those on the go at the moment.
Well, I'm really, really looking forward to both of those whenever they're ready. Please let us know.
Oh, I will do. I will do.
Because that all sounds really exciting. Malorie, thank you so much for joining me today. Like, I've loved every single minute of this. And
it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Dua.
Yeah, really, such a dream to speak to you. And for all of those who are listening, who want more, you've been incredibly generous, and you've shared with us a playlist and a reading list, which can be found on service95.com, as well as a really special video on world building for young readers. We really, really appreciate that. And also for those wanting even more, I recommend that they read the rest of the Noughts Crosses series, as well as your autobiography, Just Saying, published by one of your other superfans, Stormzy, through Murky Books.
Bless him. And thank you so much for all your kind words about my book. So I really do appreciate it. Thank you.
I mean it, and I love it. Thank you so much. Thanks for your time.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.